45. Graves of legendary black singers and the horrifying stories behind them. Before the music changed the world, these voices were already paying the price. Fame did not protect them, talent did not save them, and history did not always tell the truth. Across America, the graves of legendary black singers hold stories far more disturbing than any rumor stories of brilliance cut short, bodies worn down, and voices silenced too soon. Today, we don't chase myths. We confront reality. Because the real horror isn't what lies beneath the ground, it's what these artists endured while they were alive. Stay with us and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence, where forgotten truths are finally heard. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke's life ended in 1964 under circumstances that remain one of the most unsettling tragedies in soul music history. At the height of his influence, Cooke was not just a chart-topping star, but a visionary who reshaped R&B into modern soul. With hits like You Send Me and A Change Is Gonna Come, he became one of the first black artists to gain creative and business control in a segregated industry. His death at age 33 from a shooting at a Los Angeles motel shocked America and cut short a career that was still ascending. Cooke is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, beneath a simple dark granite slab etched with a poetic biblical line. Fans regularly leave flowers and handwritten notes treating the grave as a quiet place of reflection. Some visitors describe a strange warmth or emotional heaviness when standing there, spoken of not as fact, but as belief. For many, the grave symbolizes unfinished justice and enduring hope. When you hear, "A change is gonna come today," do you feel comfort or a promise that was never fulfilled? Johnny Ace. Johnny Ace's death remains one of the most tragic and shocking moments in early R&B history. In 1954, while his career was rapidly rising, Ace accidentally shot himself backstage on Christmas Eve, a moment that froze his promise in time. Known for his smooth, aching ballads like Pledging My Love, he represented the emotional core of post-war black music, bridging gospel feeling with secular romance. At just 25 years old, his sudden death sent shockwaves through the R&B community and left an entire generation grieving what might have been. Johnny Ace is buried at New Park Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, beneath a modest, upright granite headstone. Fans often describe the area as unusually quiet and emotionally heavy, a psychological response to his unfinished story, rather than anything supernatural. Flowers are frequently placed at the grave, especially around the holidays. For many, the site symbolizes fragile talent and lost time. How different might soul music sound today if Johnny Ace had lived to grow old with it? Little Willie John. Little Willie John's story is one of towering talent shadowed by personal struggle and a deeply tragic ending. In the 1950s, his raw, emotionally charged voice helped shape early soul and R&B influencing artists from Ray Charles to James Brown. Songs like Fever and Need Your Love So Bad showcased a singer whose intensity felt almost painful in its honesty. Just as his influence was expanding, legal troubles and instability derailed his career, turning a pioneering voice into a cautionary tale. He died in 1968 at age 30, while incarcerated in Washington state, officially from a heart attack. Little Willie John is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit, Michigan, beneath a plain, upright headstone that contrasts sharply with his musical impact. Fans still visit quietly, leaving flowers or simply standing in reflection. His grave symbolizes lost potential and the cost of untreated struggles. When you hear the emotional ache in his recordings today, do you hear brilliance or a warning? The industry ignored too long. Ray Charles. Ray Charles passed away in 2004 after complications related to liver disease, closing the life of one of the most revolutionary figures in American music. Blind from childhood, he fused gospel, blues, jazz, and R&B into a new language of soul, redefining popular music in the 1950s and 1960s. At his peak, Charles earned multiple Grammy Awards and unprecedented artistic control, proving that a black artist could dictate sound ownership and direction in a segregated industry. Ray Charles is buried at Inglewood Park Cemetery in California beneath a dignified, upright monument. Fans frequently visit, leaving flowers and standing in silence, often remarking on the intense emotional clarity they feel there. Any talk of heightened senses or energy is understood as symbolic, reflecting how his music sharpened the way people listen. His grave represents mastery through adversity. When you hear Ray Charles today, are you listening with your ears or with your soul? Jackie Wilson. Jackie Wilson's story is one of electrifying brilliance followed by an almost unbearable decline. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Wilson was among the most dynamic performers in soul and R&B, known for his acrobatic stage moves and soaring vocals on hits like Lonely Teardrops and Higher and Higher. At the height of his career, he influenced everyone from James Brown to Michael Jackson. In 1975, Wilson collapsed on stage after a heart attack, slipping into a coma that lasted nearly 9 years before his death in 1984. He is buried at West Lawn Cemetery in Wayne, Michigan, beneath a simple but dignified headstone. Fans regularly leave flowers, especially red roses, and speak of the grave as emotionally overwhelming rather than supernatural. The site symbolizes time suspended 9 lost years, echoing his unfinished life. When you watch Jackie Wilson perform today, do you see joy or the hidden cost behind the show? Fats Domino. Fats Domino's death in 2017 marked the passing of one of the last living architects of early rock and roll. Unlike many of his peers, Domino lived into his late 80s, but his life was not without peril. At his peak in the 1950s, he sold over 65 million records and helped carry New Orleans rhythm and blues into the mainstream with songs like Blueberry Hill. Soft-spoken and humble, he reshaped American music while avoiding the spotlight's excesses. He is buried at St. Louis Cemetery No. 3 in New Orleans, Louisiana, beneath a modest grave reflecting his grounded spirit. Fans frequently visit, leaving flowers and messages, especially recalling his near-death experience during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. His grave symbolizes resilience rather than fear. When you hear Fats Domino today, do you hear nostalgia or survival woven into melody? Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin's passing in 2018 closed the chapter on a voice that defined American soul. At her peak in the late 1960s and 1970s, Franklin transformed gospel power into mainstream R&B, delivering classics like Respect and Chain of Fools that became cultural statements as much as songs. With 18 Grammy Awards and over 75 million records sold worldwide, she stood as both an artistic force and a symbol of Black womanhood strength and self-determination. Franklin is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit, Michigan, in a private mausoleum that reflects dignity rather than spectacle. Fans leave flowers, vinyl sleeves, and handwritten tributes, often describing the space as emotionally heavy but comforting. Any talk of energy is symbolic, rooted in the power her music still carries. Her grave represents authority, earned, not taken. When you hear Aretha today, do you feel reverence or the courage to demand your own respect? Joe Tex. Joe Tex died suddenly in 1982 from a heart attack, ending the life of one of soul music's most honest and emotionally direct voices. At his peak in the late 1960s, Tex stood apart from polished Motown acts, using spoken monologues and raw storytelling in songs like Hold What You've Got and Skinny Legs and All. His work captured everyday Black relationships with humor, pain, and truth, making him a bridge between classic soul and modern street realism. Joe Tex was laid to rest in the American South near his spiritual roots beneath a simple grave that reflects his grounded personality. Fans still visit quietly, leaving flowers or standing in silence rather than spectacle. Any talk of energy surrounding the site is symbolic, tied to how deeply his music still resonates emotionally. His grave represents sincerity over fame. When you listen to Joe Tex today, do you hear entertainment or the sound of real life speaking back? Percy Sledge. Percy Sledge's death in 2015 from liver cancer closed the story of a man whose voice became synonymous with heartbreak and devotion. Rising from humble beginnings in Alabama, Sledge reached his peak in 1966 with When a Man Loves a Woman, a song that topped both the Billboard Hot 100 and R&B charts and sold over 1 million copies. Unlike many soul singers, his power came not from vocal acrobatics, but from vulnerability, turning personal pain into universal emotion. Percy Sledge is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Gardens in Mobile, Alabama, beneath a dignified marker that emphasizes family over fame. Fans often leave flowers and pause quietly, describing the space as calm and deeply reflective. Any sense of energy is emotional rather than mystical, rooted in how strongly his music still resonates. His grave symbolizes enduring love. When you hear Percy Sledge today, do you remember a song or a moment from your own life? Tammy Terrell. Tammy Terrell's death in 1970 remains one of the most heartbreaking losses in soul and R&B history. At just 24 years old, she died from complications of a malignant brain tumor only months after collapsing on stage during a performance with Marvin Gaye. In the late 1960s, Terrell stood at the peak of her career, helping define Motown's golden era through timeless duets like Ain't No Mountain High Enough. Her voice brought warmth, optimism, and youthful joy to a genre often shaped by pain. Tammy Terrell is buried at Mount Nebo Cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, beneath a modest grave that reflects a life cut short. Fans quietly leave flowers and handwritten letters, treating the site as a place of mourning rather than myth. Any sense of lingering energy is emotional, rooted in unrealized promise. When you hear her voice today, do you celebrate what she gave us, or grieve what she never had time to become? Muddy Waters. Blues was never just music for Muddy Waters. It was survival sung out loud. Born McKinley Morganfield in rural Mississippi in 1913, he grew up amid poverty, backbreaking labor and racial segregation in the Jim Crow South. Carrying Delta blues north during the Great Migration, he laid the foundation for modern American music. By the 1950s, Muddy Waters had become the dominant force in Chicago blues, influencing rock legends from the Rolling Stones to Jimi Hendrix. He died in 1983 from heart failure related to cancer after a long struggle with declining health. Muddy Waters is buried at Restvale Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois, beneath a tall black granite headstone engraved with blues symbolism. Fans still leave guitar picks, coins, and handwritten notes, quiet rituals of respect rather than superstition. Talk of Mojo reflects belief, not fact. The idea that blues carries memory and resilience. His grave represents collective history. When you hear blues today in rock or hip-hop, do you hear echoes of Muddy Waters still speaking through time? Lead Belly. Blues is suffering turned into survival, and Lead Belly lived that truth completely. Born Huddie Ledbetter in Louisiana in 1888, he grew up poor in the Jim Crow South working fields and learning songs passed down through hard labor and confinement. His powerful 12-string guitar and booming voice carried prison work songs, spirituals, and folk blues into the American consciousness. By the late 1930s and 1940s, Lead Belly had influenced the roots of blues folk and eventually rock recording songs like Goodnight Irene that would outlive him by generations. He died in 1949 from ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, after years of physical decline. Lead Belly is buried at Shiloh Baptist Church Cemetery near Mooringsport, Louisiana, beneath a simple upright headstone that reflects his rural origins. Fans sometimes leave guitar picks or small coins, quiet gestures of respect, not ritual. Talk of Mojo surrounding his grave is symbolic, tied to the way blues preserves memory. His resting place stands for endurance. When modern music channels pain into power, do you hear Lead Belly still holding the roots together? Jimmy Reed. Blues is pain shaped into rhythm, and Jimmy Reed's life carried that truth with brutal honesty. Born Mathis James Reed in Mississippi in 1925, he grew up in poverty and racial segregation before carrying Delta blues north to Chicago. His relaxed vocals and offbeat harmonica style helped define electric blues in the 1950s, producing enduring hits like Big Boss Man and Bright Light's Big City. Reed's sound became a bridge from blues to early rock, deeply influencing artists such as Elvis Presley and the Rolling Stones. Yet behind the music, he battled alcoholism and epilepsy struggles that followed him until his death in 1976 from respiratory failure. Jimmy Reed is buried at Lincoln Cemetery in Blue Island, Illinois, beneath a modest, upright headstone. Fans quietly leave coins or harmonica reeds, gestures rooted in respect rather than ritual. Talk of Mojo reflects belief in blues as shared memory, the idea that suffering leaves rhythm behind. His grave symbolizes resilience. When you hear blues echoed in rock or hip-hop today, can you still feel Jimmy Reed's uneven heartbeat driving it forward? T-Bone Walker. Blues is pain transformed into motion, and T-Bone Walker turned hardship into electric expression. Born Aaron Thibault. Walker in Texas in 1910, he grew up poor, navigating segregation while absorbing street music and vaudeville rhythms. By the 1940s, he revolutionized American music by bringing the electric guitar to the front of the stage, shaping modern blues with smooth phrasing and jazzy sophistication. His influence ran straight through B.B. King, Chuck Berry, and the birth of rock guitar itself. Walker suffered a stroke in the 1970s and died in 1975 from pneumonia after years of declining health. T-Bone Walker is buried at Inglewood Park Cemetery in California beneath a simple, dignified marker. Fans leave guitar picks or pause in silence, honoring the roots rather than chasing myth. Talk of Mojo reflects belief that blues carries memory forward. His grave represents movement that never stops. When rock or hip-hop leans on guitar-driven emotion, can you still hear T-Bone Walker dancing beneath the sound? John Lee Hooker. Blues is suffering turned into rhythm, and John Lee Hooker embodied that truth with relentless force. Born in Mississippi in 1917, he grew up poor under segregation, absorbing Delta blues before carrying it north during the Great Migration. Hooker's hypnotic boogie-style raw vocals, stomping rhythm, and minimal chords became a foundation of American music. At his peak in the 1950s and 1960s, his sound influenced rock-funk, and later hip-hop, shaping artists from the Rolling Stones to ZZ Top. He lived longer than many peers, passing away in 2001 after years of declining health. John Lee Hooker is buried at Chapel of the Chimes Memorial Park in Hayward, California, beneath a tall, black granite headstone. Fans leave coins, guitar picks, or simply listen in silence. Talk of Mojo reflects belief, not fact, the idea that blues stores memory. His grave symbolizes endurance. When modern music leans on repetition and groove, do you hear Hooker's eternal foot stomp still driving the beat? Big Joe Turner. Blues is pain amplified into power, and Big Joe Turner carried that power in his thunderous voice. Born in Kansas City in 1911, Turner grew up working odd jobs in a racially divided America, singing in clubs where blues and jazz blurred together. His booming blues shouter style helped define jump blues in the 1940s, laying critical groundwork for rock and roll. Songs like Shake, Rattle, and Roll Bridged Blues, R&B, and early rock later reshaped by artists such as Bill Haley. Turner died in 1985 from heart failure after years of declining health, leaving behind a voice that shaped an era. Big Joe Turner is buried at Inglewood Park Cemetery in California beneath a simple black granite marker shared with family. Fans sometimes leave flowers or small tokens, acts of remembrance rather than ritual. Talk of Mojo reflects how blues carries collective memory. His grave symbolizes strength born from struggle. When you hear rock's raw vocal force today, Can you trace it back to Big Joe Turner's mighty shout? Son House. Blues is suffering sung into truth, and Son House lived that truth without compromise. Born Eddie James House Jr. in rural Mississippi in 1902, he grew up in extreme poverty under segregation, working the land before turning pain into sound. His raw, spiritual Delta blues, marked by fierce slide guitar and preaching-style vocals, became foundational to American music. Though never commercially wealthy, his influence reached far beyond his lifetime, shaping artists like Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, and later generations of rock musicians. Son House died in 1988 after years of declining health, long after the spotlight had faded. He is buried at Mount Hazel Missionary Baptist Church Cemetery in Robinsonville, Mississippi, beneath a simple, low grave marker that reflects the humility of his life. Fans sometimes leave coins or guitar picks, quiet gestures of respect rather than ritual. Talk of Mojo is symbolic blues as memory, not myth. His grave stands for endurance and truth. When you hear raw emotion in modern blues or rock, can you still hear Son House calling from the roots? Lightnin' Hopkins. Blues is hardship turned into testimony, and Lightnin' Hopkins carried that testimony straight from the streets of Texas. Born Sam John Hopkins in 1912, he grew up poor in the segregated South, learning music informally while working farms and street corners. His loose, improvised guitar style and conversational vocals defined Texas blues, influencing generations beyond the genre. At his peak in the 1950s and 1960s, Hopkins recorded over 85 albums, an extraordinary output that fed the roots of blues rock and eventually hip-hop's raw storytelling. He died in 1982 from complications related to esophageal cancer. Lightnin' Hopkins is buried at Forest Park Lawndale Cemetery in Houston, Texas, beneath a low black granite marker carved with a guitar. Fans leave coins, bottle caps, or guitar picks, gestures of respect, not ritual. Talk of Mojo reflects belief that blues preserves lived experience. His grave symbolizes independence and resilience. When modern music embraces raw truth over polish, can you hear Lightnin' Hopkins still speaking plainly through the sound? Sonny Boy Williamson sang. Blues is loneliness turned into voice, and Sonny Boy Williamson II carried that voice with haunting authority. Born Alec Rice Miller in Mississippi around 1912, he grew up in poverty and racial segregation, absorbing the Delta's pain and resilience. His distinctive harmonica tone, playful, menacing, and deeply human, became one of the most influential sounds in blues history. By the 1950s, he was a central figure on Chicago radio and records, shaping the future of blues and rock while inspiring artists from Eric Clapton to Led Zeppelin. He died in his sleep in 1965 from heart failure after a life spent constantly moving. Sonny Boy Williamson II is buried at Sunnyside Cemetery in Tutwiler, Mississippi, beneath an upright headstone engraved with his portrait and harmonica. Fans leave harmonicas, coins, and notes as acts of respect. Talk of Mojo reflects belief in blues as memory carried forward. His grave symbolizes voice that refuses silence. When you hear a harmonica cry today, do you recognize Sonny Boy still breathing through it? Wynonie Harris. Blues and early R&B were often born from survival, and Wynonie Harris sang with the raw urgency of a man who knew struggle firsthand. Born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1915, Harris grew up amid poverty and racial barriers, turning street-smart confidence into sound. In the late 1940s, he became one of the loudest voices of jump blues, scoring massive hits like Good Rockin' Tonight. At his peak, Harris helped push blues toward rock and roll, directly influencing Elvis Presley and later rock vocalists. Yet shifting tastes and industry neglect led to a quiet decline. He died in 1969 from esophageal cancer, largely removed from the fame he once commanded. Wynonie Harris is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Erlanger, Kentucky, beneath a modest grave that reflects his overlooked legacy. Fans leave flowers or pause briefly, honoring influence rather than myth. Talk of Mojo symbolizes how blues carries lived experience forward. His grave stands for endurance. When rock music shouts freedom and desire, can you still hear Wynonie Harris echoing at its roots? Big Maybelle. Blues is pain given volume, and Big Maybelle sang with a force that could not be ignored. Born Mabel Louise Smith in Tennessee in 1924, she grew up poor in a segregated America where opportunity for black women, especially plus-size women, was brutally limited. Yet her commanding voice cut through those barriers. In the 1950s, Big Maybelle became a defining figure in R&B and blues, recording emotionally charged songs like Candy and Whole Lotta Shakin', going on helping bridge gospel intensity, blues, sorrow, and early rock expression. Despite her influence, personal struggles and health issues followed her throughout her career. Big Maybelle died in 1972 from complications related to diabetes and is buried at Southern Memorial Park in North Miami, Florida. Her grave is modest and quiet, reflecting a life where greatness often went under-recognized. Fans sometimes leave flowers or simply stand in silence. Talk of Mojo is symbolic blues as memory and resilience. Her resting place represents strength carried alone. When you hear raw power in soul or rock vocals today, do you hear Big Maybelle still standing tall at the roots? Cab Calloway. Jazz's intelligence fused with emotion, and Cab Calloway embodied that union with rare charisma. Rising to fame in the 1930s, Calloway became one of the most influential band leaders of the swing era, fronting the Cotton Club and bringing scat singing into the mainstream. His style, bold suits, elastic phrasing, and razor-sharp timing turned jazz into a theatrical language of wit and freedom. In his later years, he continued performing and mentoring, passing away in 1994 after suffering a stroke, closing a life that stretched across nearly the entire history of modern jazz. Calloway is buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, in a dignified family plot marked by a restrained stone. Musical symbols are subtle rather than grand, inviting contemplation. Visitors often describe a striking stillness, an atmosphere that feels thoughtfully composed. Any sense of presence is reflective, not mystical, echoing jazz as an unfinished conversation. His grave stands for black intellectual creativity, improvisation as thought rhythm as reason. When jazz continues to evolve, can you still hear Cab Calloway's mind dancing inside the music? Louis Armstrong. Jazz is intellect guided by feeling, and Louis Armstrong transformed both forever. Emerging from extreme poverty in New Orleans, Armstrong revolutionized jazz in the 1920s by shifting it from collective ensemble playing to solo-driven expression. His trumpet phrasing, rhythmic swing, and unmistakable gravelly voice reshaped American music, influencing everyone from Duke Ellington to Frank Sinatra. At his peak, Armstrong was not only a virtuoso, but a global ambassador of jazz, proving that improvisation itself was a form of thinking out loud. He died in 1971 after years of heart and kidney problems, closing a career that spanned 5 decades. Armstrong is buried at Flushing Cemetery in Queens, New York, in a family plot marked by a dignified monument engraved with a trumpet. Visitors often describe the space as calm yet emotionally full, as if the music paused rather than ended. Any talk of energy reflects symbolism, jazz as a continuous thought. His grave affirms black intellectual genius and creative freedom. When you hear swing today, do you recognize Armstrong still teaching the world how to breathe between notes? Duke Ellington. Jazz is intellect shaped by emotion, and Duke Ellington elevated it into a language of thought. Rising from Washington, D.C., Ellington became one of the most influential composers in American history, writing over 1,000 pieces that blended sophistication with deep feeling. His orchestra was not just a band, but a living laboratory of sound where individuality and structure coexisted. At his peak from the 1930s through the 1960s, Ellington redefined jazz as serious art influencing classical composers, film music, and modern songwriting. He died in 1974 from lung cancer, marking the end of a mind that never stopped composing. Ellington rests at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, in a dignified family plot shared with loved ones. The monument is formal and restrained, reflecting discipline over spectacle. Visitors often describe a quiet, contemplative atmosphere jazz as thought held in silence. His grave represents Black intellectual freedom and creative mastery. When jazz continues to evolve, do you hear Duke Ellington still searching for the next perfect harmony? Billie Holiday. Jazz is intellect wrapped in pain, and Billie Holiday turned personal suffering into timeless expression. Rising from poverty and abuse, Holiday reshaped jazz singing in the 1930s and 1940s with phrasing that bent time itself. Her voice was not technically powerful, but emotionally precise, influencing generations of vocalists across jazz, soul, and pop. Songs like Strange Fruit transformed jazz into social commentary, forcing America to confront racial violence through sound. By the end of her life, years of addiction, illness, and systemic mistreatment had taken their toll. She died in 1959 at just 44, while under police guard in a hospital room. Billie Holiday is buried at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, beneath a dark granite marker that carries quiet weight. Visitors often describe the space as emotionally heavy, marked by stillness rather than spectacle. Her grave symbolizes jazz as unfinished thought beauty shaped by injustice. When you hear Billie Holiday today, do you hear sorrow alone or intelligence strong enough to survive it? Bessie Smith. Jazz is intellect fueled by feeling, and Bessie Smith carried both with unmatched authority. Rising from poverty in the early 20th century South, Smith became the highest-paid Black performer of the 1920s, earning the title Empress of the Blues. Her commanding voice bridged blues and jazz, shaping American popular music with emotional precision and narrative power. At her peak, she recorded dozens of influential sides for Columbia Records, turning lived experience into disciplined art. Her life ended tragically in 1937 after a severe automobile accident, closing a career that had already transformed the sound and business of Black music. Bessie Smith is buried at Mount Lawn Cemetery in Sharon Hill, Pennsylvania. For decades, her grave was unmarked, an absence that spoke volumes about how Black genius was neglected. When a headstone was finally placed, its simplicity became symbolic. Visitors describe the site as solemn and reflective jazz thought held in stillness. Her grave affirms Black intellectual creativity and endurance. When vocalists command truth through song today, can you hear Bessie Smith still teaching the power of presence? Dinah Washington. Jazz is intellect sharpened by emotion, and Dinah Washington mastered that balance with fearless precision. Rising from poverty in Alabama, Washington became one of the most versatile vocalists of the 1950s, effortlessly moving between jazz, blues, R&B, and pop. Nicknamed the Queen of the Blues, she brought clarity, timing, and emotional control to every performance, influencing generations of singers across genres. At her peak, she scored multiple chart hits and won a Grammy Award, proving that technical intelligence and raw feeling could coexist in one voice. Her life, however, was marked by instability and pressure. She died in 1963 at age 39 from an accidental overdose involving prescription drugs and alcohol. Dinah Washington is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, in a family plot marked by a dignified but restrained headstone. Visitors often describe the site as emotionally divided, quiet, yet heavy, reflecting a life of brilliance and turmoil. Her grave symbolizes jazz as disciplined thought under strain. When singers balance vulnerability with control today, do you hear Dinah Washington's influence still guiding the line? Sarah Vaughan. Jazz is intellect carried by emotion, and Sarah Vaughan elevated the human voice into an instrument of thought. Emerging in the 1940s, Vaughan possessed an extraordinary vocal range and harmonic intelligence that redefined jazz singing. Her phrasing moved like a horn solo, precise, daring, and deeply expressive, earning her admiration from musicians and scholars alike. At her peak, she recorded definitive albums that bridged bebop sophistication and emotional warmth. In her later years, health issues slowed her output, and she passed away in 1990 from lung cancer, leaving behind a legacy built on mastery rather than spectacle. Sarah Vaughan is buried at Rose Hill Cemetery in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, in a family plot marked with restrained elegance. Visitors often describe the space as calm and contemplative, a fitting stillness for a voice known for control and depth. Her grave symbolizes jazz as an ongoing idea, discipline meeting feeling. When modern vocalists explore range and nuance, do you hear Sarah Vaughan still teaching how thought becomes sound? Ella Fitzgerald. Jazz is intelligence expressed through joy, and Ella Fitzgerald embodied that balance with unmatched grace. Rising from hardship in Harlem, Fitzgerald transformed vocal jazz with her flawless pitch-rhythmic precision and revolutionary scat singing. From the 1930s onward, she became a defining voice of American music, recording over 200 albums and winning 14 Grammy Awards. At her peak, Ella's voice functioned like a master instrument, effortless yet intellectually demanding, proving that swing discipline and freedom could exist together. She passed away in 1996 from complications related to diabetes, closing a career built on excellence rather than controversy. Ella Fitzgerald is buried at Inglewood Park Cemetery in California, in a dignified family plot marked by simplicity. Visitors often describe the area as peaceful and emotionally light, reflecting the warmth her music carried. Her grave symbolizes jazz as clarity of thought music that uplifts without denying struggle. When jazz continues to inspire calm in a restless world, do you hear Ella Fitzgerald reminding us that intelligence can still swing? Clifford Brown. Jazz is intellect moving at the speed of emotion, and Clifford Brown embodied that brilliance with rare purity. Emerging in the early 1950s, Brown was widely regarded as one of the most technically gifted trumpet players in jazz history. His tone was warm, his phrasing mathematically precise, yet deeply human, and his improvisations showed a mind operating several steps ahead. At a time when jazz was often associated with chaos and excess, Brown stood out for disciplined clarity and moral focus. Just as his career reached full momentum, he was killed in a car accident in 1956 at only 25 years old, an abrupt ending that stunned the jazz world. Clifford Brown is buried at Mount Lawn Cemetery in Sharon Hill, Pennsylvania, beneath a dignified, upright marker engraved with musical symbolism. Visitors often describe the site as solemn and reflective, marked by the weight of unrealized potential. His grave represents jazz as interrupted thought, genius paused mid-sentence. When modern musicians pursue technical perfection with soul, do you hear Clifford Brown still finishing the ideas he never had time to complete? Nat King Cole. Jazz is intellect softened by emotion, and Nat King Cole mastered that balance with effortless elegance. Rising from Chicago in the 1930s, Cole began as a brilliant jazz pianist before becoming one of the most recognizable vocalists in American history. His warm baritone and refined phrasing turned jazz into mainstream sophistication, bridging swing pop and soul. At his peak in the 1940s and 1950s, he sold over 50 million records worldwide and broke racial barriers as one of the first black artists to host a national television show. He died in 1965 from lung cancer, a consequence of heavy smoking at just 45 years old. Nat King Cole is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, in a family plot marked by dignity and restraint. Visitors often describe the space as calm and intimate, a place of quiet listening rather than spectacle. His grave symbolizes jazz as timeless thought, grace under pressure. When his voice still comforts listeners decades later, do you hear nostalgia or the enduring intelligence of American music at its most humane? Thelonious Monk. Jazz is intellect daring emotion to keep up, and Thelonious Monk redefined both. Emerging in the 1940s, Monk became one of the architects of bebop, known for dissonant harmonies, jagged rhythms, and compositions that sounded deliberately unfinished, because thinking to Monk never was. His style was unmistakable: percussive piano touch, abrupt pauses, and melodies that challenged listeners to lean in. Though often misunderstood during his peak years, Monk's influence reshaped modern jazz theory. He spent his final years largely withdrawn from public life and died in 1982 after complications from a stroke. Monk is buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, in a family plot marked with quiet restraint. Visitors describe a thoughtful stillness, as if the music is thinking in silence. Any sense of presence is symbolic jazz as an idea still working itself out. His grave stands for Black intellectual freedom and creative risk. When modern jazz embraces the unexpected, do you hear Monk still asking the music to think harder? Gene Ammons. Jazz is intellect carried on breath, and Gene "Jug" Ammons made the tenor saxophone speak with warmth and authority. Emerging in the 1940s, Ammons blended bebop intelligence with blues feeling, creating a sound that was both accessible and deeply sophisticated. His tone was large and humane, rooted in swing but flexible enough to absorb modern harmony. At his peak in the 1950s and 1960s, Ammons recorded prolifically and became a bridge between hard bop and soul jazz, influencing generations of saxophonists who followed. Gene Ammons is buried at Lincoln Cemetery in Blue Island, Illinois, beneath a simple, low granite marker that emphasizes substance over show. Visitors often describe the site as quietly grounded, a place that invites listening rather than spectacle. His grave symbolizes jazz as collective memory thought, shaped by lived experience. When modern jazz leans into groove without losing intelligence, do you hear Gene Ammons still breathing life into the line? Alberta Hunter. Jazz is intellect tempered by lived experience, and Alberta Hunter embodied that wisdom with quiet authority. Born in 1895 in Memphis and raised in poverty, Hunter entered the music world early, shaping blues and jazz with a voice that carried restraint, clarity, and emotional truth. She recorded influential songs in the 1920s and 1930s, then made a decision few artists dare. She stepped away from fame at her peak. For more than 20 years, Hunter worked as a nurse, choosing service over spotlight, before returning to the stage in her 80s with undiminished insight and control. Alberta Hunter is buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, beneath a modest stone that reflects a life defined by discipline rather than spectacle. Visitors often describe the site as calm and grounding. Her grave symbolizes jazz as enduring thought creativity that matures rather than fades. When artists speak of reinvention and longevity, do you hear Alberta Hunter reminding us that true intelligence knows when to step back and when to return? Little Richard. Rock and roll was born from Black creativity, and Little Richard set it on fire. In the 1950s, his explosive sound-pounding piano, screaming vocals, and unfiltered sexuality shattered every musical rule America had accepted. Songs like Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally didn't just entertain, they detonated. Yet popular history often softened his role, allowing others to profit from a style he pioneered. His flamboyant queerness and refusal to be contained made him both revolutionary and difficult for mainstream culture to fully credit. Little Richard is buried at Oakwood University Memorial Gardens in Huntsville, Alabama. His grave stands out in placement and presence, reflecting a man who never blended in. Fans describe the site as emotionally charged, a reminder that rock is raw energy, not polish. Any talk of vibration or fire is symbolic. His music still shakes the ground. His legacy forces a reckoning if rock changed the world. Why are its Black architects still under-acknowledged? Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Rock and roll was born from black sacred sound, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe lit the first match. Long before electric guitars defined rebellion, Tharpe fused gospel fire with blues grit, playing distorted electric guitar and singing with unapologetic power in the 1930s and 1940s. Her style broke every boundary, sacred and secular, church and stage, yet popular history later pushed her to the margins while male rock stars carried her sound to global fame. Artists from Elvis Presley to Chuck Berry openly drew from her phrasing and guitar attack, even as her name faded from mainstream credit. Sister Rosetta Tharpe is buried at Northwood Cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her grave, once unmarked, now stands as a corrective to history rather than a spectacle. Visitors describe a strong emotional presence, symbolic, not supernatural, reflecting rock as raw spiritual energy. Her legacy asks a hard question: if rock changed the world, why did its black godmother have to wait decades to be fully acknowledged? Bo Diddley. Rock and roll was built on black rhythm, and Bo Diddley created one of its most indestructible foundations. Emerging in the 1950s, Diddley introduced a driving, syncopated beat rooted in African rhythms, the now famous Bo Diddley beat that reshaped American music. His rectangular guitar, chant-like vocals, and minimalist power broke every convention of blues and pop. While his influence fueled artists from Buddy Holly to the Rolling Stones' mainstream history, often minimized his role, allowing others to profit from a sound he invented. Bo Diddley is buried at Rosemary Hill Cemetery in Bronson, Florida, beneath a tall headstone carved with his iconic square guitar. The grave's placement beneath spreading trees gives it a grounded, almost rhythmic stillness. Fans describe the site as forceful and energetic, symbolizing rock as raw momentum. His legacy raises a necessary question of justice. If the beat still drives modern music, why isn't Bo Diddley always named at its center? Mahalia Jackson. When a voice becomes faith music turns into testimony, and Mahalia Jackson stood at that intersection. Rising from New Orleans church roots, she transformed gospel into a national moral force, refusing secular contracts to protect its spiritual core. Her singing fueled the civil rights movement. She performed at rallies and famously sang before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. That commitment came with sacrifice, constant travel surveillance, and pressure, but Jackson never separated sound from belief. For her, gospel was not performance. It was prayer carried on breath. Mahalia Jackson is buried at Providence Memorial Park in Metairie, Louisiana, in a site many consider sacred. The marker bears religious symbolism and scripture, drawing visitors who describe quiet calm rather than spectacle. Stories of peace felt at the grave are expressions of faith, not claims of the supernatural. Her legacy is ethical as much as musical courage, conviction, and service. In an era of noise, do we still listen for voices that turn song into conscience? Paul Robeson. When a voice becomes faith, it also becomes resistance, and Paul Robeson used his as both. Trained as a lawyer and celebrated as a singer and actor, Robeson turned spirituals and folk songs into moral declarations. His deep bass voice carried messages of dignity, labor rights, and global black solidarity at a time when speaking out invited punishment. During the Cold War, he was surveilled, blacklisted, and stripped of his passport for nearly a decade, sacrificing career and income rather than renounce his beliefs. For Robeson, music was conscience made audible. Robeson is buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, beneath a dignified marker inscribed with words affirming freedom and choice. Visitors often describe the site as solemn and grounding, a place of reflection rather than spectacle. Any sense of presence is ethical, not mystical music as testimony. His legacy endures as a standard for courage. In an age of convenience, would we risk everything to let our voices stand for justice? These graves are not just places of rest, they are mirrors held up to history. Behind every headstone lies brilliance shaped by sacrifice and voices that changed America while paying a heavy price. From soul and blues to jazz, rock, and gospel, these legends carried culture forward long before they were fully protected, credited, or compensated. The question is no longer whether their music lives on, it clearly does. The real debate is, has America truly honored these black pioneers, or has it simply enjoyed what they gave and moved on? Share your thoughts below and stay with Legends of Black Excellence, as we keep telling the stories that history too often forgets.